It is November 15th, 1993. Outside the Superior Court of the State of New York, the Manhattan air is biting, a sharp transition from the humid autumn into an unforgiving winter. But inside room 402, the atmosphere is stifling. It smells of heavy floor wax, stale coffee, and the metallic hum of an aging ventilation system that has not been serviced since the 70s. You can hear the rhythmic ticking of the analog clock on the back wall, each second sounding like a hammer hitting an anvil. At the defense table sits 17-year-old Zayide Vane. She looks smaller than her age, draped in a borrowed charcoal blazer with those massive, structured shoulder pads so common in the early 90s. Her hair is cut into a jagged, chin-length grunge bob, tucked behind ears that are flushed bright red. She is not looking at the jury. She is not looking at her mother, Adele, who is sobbing silently in the third row. Zayide is staring at a small plastic evidence bag sitting on the prosecutor's podium. Inside that bag is a translucent, neon green Motorola Bravo pager. In 1993, this was the ultimate status symbol for a teenager. For Zayide, it was the digital cage that led her to Pier 54 on a cold October night with a .22 caliber pistol in her pocket. The lead prosecutor, a man with a sharp, tailored suit and a haircut that screams Wall Street ambition, picks up the bag. He holds it aloft, the neon plastic catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he begins, his voice dropping to a low, intense vibrato. "This is how Kaylen Thorne died. He didn't die because of a random act of street violence. He died because of a sequence, a code. In 1993, our children have created a language we do not speak. They inhabit a world we cannot see." Zayide Vane used this numeric language to lure her lover to a derelict pier, and then she executed him in cold blood. Zayide flinches, her knuckles turning white as she grips the edge of the mahogany table. The tension in the room is thick enough to choke on. Everyone in the gallery is leaning forward, eyes darting between the pale girl and the glowing green beeper. They want to know why a straight-A student with a passion for archaeology and Victorian history would throw it all away for a 19-year-old boy in a red Corvette. But before we unlock the digital vault of the 1993 pager code homicide, I want to welcome you to the Justice Minute. We are about to dive deep into a story that challenged everything the American legal system thought it knew about youth, identity, and the price of survival. If you are ready for a deep dive into the dark side of the 90s, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We are building a community here for those who seek the truth behind the headlines, and we want you with us. Where are you watching from today? What time is it there as you're joining this investigation? And what's the weather like outside your window? Let us know in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's step back into that courtroom. Let's look at the girl in the oversized blazer, because while the prosecutor sees a remorseless predator, the truth buried in those pager logs is far more complex. This was an era of moral panic, a time when the media warned of a new generation of youth who felt nothing. They called them super predators. They said they were heartless. But as Zayide Vane watched that neon pager, she wasn't thinking about the future. She was thinking about the messages that started appearing on her screen 3 months earlier. Messages that didn't come in letters, but in numbers. 143, I love you. 911, emergency. 187, murder. In 1993, the digital footprint was a series of beeps on a belt clip, and on Pier 54, the signal finally went dead. The prosecutor turns back to the jury, his eyes narrowed. She says it was self-defense. She says she was afraid. But you don't bring a loaded gun to a romantic meeting unless you've already decided how the night ends. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a calculation. Zayide finally looks up. Her eyes are dark, circled by smudged black eyeliner, a remnant of her night spent at the Sepulchre, the East Village goth club where she first met Kaylin. She looks at the prosecutor, then at the pager, and for the first time in the trial, her lips move. It is a whisper, so quiet the court reporter misses it, but it carries the weight of a confession. Or perhaps a warning. The world was about to find out that in the case of Vane versus Thorne, the victim was a ghost, and the killer was the only person who knew his real name. To understand the tragedy of Zayide Vane and Kaylin Thorne, you have to understand the spring of 1993. This was a year of transition. The neon, hairspray-soaked excess of the 1980s was finally bleeding out, replaced by the grey, rain-slicked aesthetic of the 90s. In Manhattan, the streets felt raw. This was a city where 5,000 payphones served as the primary nervous system for millions of people. If you wanted to reach someone, you didn't send a text. You found a quarter, dialed a beeper, and waited by the curb for the world to call you back. The East Village was the epicenter of this shift. It was a place of grit and experimental energy. And tucked away in a basement on Avenue B was a club called the Sepulchre. The Sepulchre wasn't your typical dance hall. It was a temple for the ether-goth subculture. This was a scene defined by a romantic, morbid fascination with the past. We are talking about teenagers and 20-somethings dressed in black velvet, torn fishnets, and heavy silver jewelry. The air inside always smelled of clove, cigarettes, and cheap incense. Zayide Vane was 17 years old, but she moved through this world like a ghost from a century prior. She was obsessed with archaeology and the Victorian cult of mourning. While other girls her age were wearing neon windbreakers and listening to Whitney Houston, Zayide was busy annotating 19th century poetry and painting her room the color of a fresh bruise. She was intelligent, intense, and deeply lonely. Then came the night she met Kaylin Thorne. Kaylin was 19, and in the world of the Sepulchre, he was an anomaly. He didn't look like he belonged in a basement. He had a look that screamed, rich idiot with no day job, the kind of effortless, spoiled charm that only comes from a trust fund and a lack of consequences. He had sharp features and a smile that seemed to hide a secret joke at your expense. But what really set him apart was his car. In a neighborhood where most people took the subway or walked through the grime, Kaylin drove a late-model red Corvette. It was a flash of loud, arrogant color in a world of black velvet. The moment they met, the connection was like a short circuit. Friends who were there that night say the intensity was immediate. Kaylin didn't just talk to Zayide, he studied her. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive leather and mint drowning out the clove smoke. He told her he was a traveler, a collector of stories. He told her he had never seen anyone who looked so at home in the dark. For a 17-year-old girl who felt invisible to her peers, Kaylin Thorne was like a sun that had suddenly decided to shine only on her. As their relationship blossomed over the next few weeks, it was defined by the technology of the era. They didn't have instant messaging. They had the pager. Kaylin bought Zayide, that neon green beeper we saw in the courtroom. It was her lifeline to him. They developed a numeric language, a shorthand for their obsession. If her pager vibrated and showed 143, she knew he was thinking, I love you. If it showed 07734, she would turn the pager upside down to read the word HELLO. But there was a darker side to this digital connection. Kaylin was possessive in a way that felt romantic at first, but quickly turned into a subtle form of imprisonment. He wanted to know where she was every second of the day. He would page her at 3 in the morning just to see how fast she would run to the nearest payphone. What time is it there as you're listening to this? Is the sun coming up, or are you deep in the night like Zayide was back in 1993? Let me know in the comments. Zayide's mother, Adele, started to notice the changes. Her daughter was no longer reading her archaeology books. She was staring at that green screen, waiting for the next set of numbers. Zayide was becoming a shadow of herself, consumed by a boy who seemed too good to be true. And in 1993, if something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. Kalen Thorne was a master of the double life trope. By day, he was the doting boyfriend in the red Corvette, taking Zayide to the cloisters or buying her antique lockets. But by night, he was something else entirely. He was a creature of the early internet, the clunky, text-based world of bulletin board systems and anarchist forums. He was a social engineer before that term even had a name. He wasn't just dating Zayide, he was archiving her. He kept microcassette recordings of their phone calls. He had journals filled with her handwriting samples. He was building a file on her, a comprehensive map of her fears, her dreams, and her triggers. As the spring turned into a sweltering New York summer, the pager messages began to change. The 143 codes were replaced by something more urgent, something unnerving. Zayide started receiving pages from unknown numbers, codes she didn't recognize, strings of numbers that felt like threats. She would page Kalen, desperate for an explanation, but he would claim he didn't know what she was talking about. He told her she was becoming paranoid. He told her the super predators the news was always talking about were probably tracking her signal. He was gaslighting her through a translucent green plastic box. This was the beginning of a digital cage. In 1993, there was no way to block a number on a pager. There was no way to trace where a page was coming from without a court order that the police weren't going to give to a theatrical goth teenager. Zayide was trapped in a loop of numeric harassment, and the only person she thought she could trust was the very person who was holding the remote. The intensity of their bond was reaching a breaking point. Zayide felt like she was losing her mind. She started carrying a notebook, writing down every code, trying to find a pattern. She was a student of history, trying to solve the mystery of her own life. But she didn't realize that the man she loved wasn't a traveler or a collector. He was an architect, and he was currently building the pier where their story would end, in a flash of gunpowder and a final silent beep. The prosecutor in the courtroom would later call this the honeymoon phase of a killer. But for Zayide Vane, it was the moment she realized that in the language of 1993, emergency didn't just mean a phone call, it meant survival. By the time the sweltering heat of August 1993 settled over Manhattan, the romantic fog had lifted, revealing a jagged, terrifying reality. Zayide Vane was no longer the girl who spent her afternoons lost in Victorian poetry. She was a girl who lived by the vibration on her hip. The neon green pager that once symbolized a secret connection with Kalen had become a digital shackle. The transition was subtle. It started with ghost pages, vibrations that occurred when she was alone in her room, displaying strings of numbers that made no sense. 333 000. At first, Kalen was supportive. He would sit with her in his red Corvette, holding her hand as she scrolled through the log. He whispered that the city was a dangerous place, that super predators were everywhere, and maybe someone was trying to find her. He was feeding her paranoia while pretending to be her only shield. The search for answers led Zayide to the local precinct, where she met a man named Blythe Adair. Blythe was a detective with the Juvenile Bureau, a man who had seen the raw underbelly of the 1993 crime wave. He was one of the few who understood that the technology of the era could be weaponized. He spoke to Zayide about a technique called pager cloning. In 1993, it was possible for a skilled person to intercept a pager's unique identification number using a clunky radio scanner. Once they had that number, They could program it into a second device. This meant someone could see every message Zayide received. Even worse, they could send messages that appeared to come from her own inner circle. The psychological toll was immense. Zayide was experiencing what modern experts call digital gaslighting, but in 1993 there wasn't a name for it. There was only the feeling of being hunted by a phantom. She would be standing at a subway platform, the air thick and smelling of ozone, and her pager would go off. 911. Emergency. She would sprint to the nearest row of silver payphones, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd drop a quarter into the slot, dial the number, and wait. But on the other end, there was never a voice. Just the rhythmic, mechanical screech of a dial-up modem or a cold, empty silence. This created a state of constant hypervigilance. Zayide stopped going to school. She stopped eating. The only person she felt safe with was Kalen, the very man who had given her the device. He told her she was unstable and that she needed him to archive their lives for her own safety. He began recording their conversations on microcassettes, claiming it was evidence in case the stalker ever stepped out of the shadows. This is where the story gets incredibly dark, and we are just scratching the surface of the 1993 pager code case. If you are enjoying this deep dive into forensic history, please give this video a like. It tells the YouTube algorithm that this is the kind of content people want to see, and it helps our channel grow more than you know. The stakes reached a fever pitch when the codes turned violent. On a Tuesday night in September, Zayide was at a diner when her pager lit up with a sequence that stopped her breath. 187. In the language of the California Penal Code, a code that had become common knowledge through 90s gangster rap and police dramas, that number stood for murder. Zayide looked around the diner. Was the person who sent it sitting in the corner booth? Were they watching her from a passing car? She felt like she was trapped in a black box of communication. In 1993, the duty to retreat was a heavy legal standard. The prosecution would later argue that Zayide could have simply turned the pager off. They said she could have walked away from the relationship, but Blythe Adair's notes from the time tell a different story. He saw a girl who was being psychologically kidnapped. Her reality was being rewritten by the numbers on a screen. Kalen was her only source of truth, but he was also the one holding the pen. What's the weather like today where you are? Here, as we look back at this 1993 summer, the air feels just as heavy and suffocating as it did for Zayide back then. Let me know in the comments. The intensity of the harassment was designed to lead to a violent outburst. Every 911 page was a poke at a wounded animal. Every 187 was a promise of an end. Zayide started carrying a notebook, a collected writing specimen that the court would later use against her. In it, she didn't write about archaeology. She wrote about the ghost who was coming for her. She wrote that she needed to strike first before the sequence reached its final number. By October, the digital prison was complete. Kalen Thorne had successfully isolated her from her mother, her school, and her own sense of self. He had cloned her social world, sending pages to himself from her number to create a false trail of her obsession with him. He was the victim in the eyes of the digital record, while Zayide was being cast as the unhinged predator. The stage was set for Pier 54. The numeric codes had done their job. They had moved Zayide Vane across the board like a chess piece, and now it was time for the final move. The prosecutor in the courtroom would call it a calculated hit, but the defense would call it the only way to turn off the beeping. The night of October 14th, 1993, was the kind of cold that sticks to your skin, a damp Manhattan chill that smelled of salt, rotting timber, and diesel. Pier 54 was a skeletal remains of a once great terminal, now just a jagged line of rusted iron and broken wood jutting into the Hudson River. Zayide Vane stood at the edge of the pier, her combat boots crunching on broken glass. In her pocket, she felt the weight of the .22 caliber pistol she had purchased from a punk guy at a local arcade. Her pager had been vibrating all night, with a single repeating code, 911. Kalen Thorne was waiting for her, leaning against the hood of his red Corvette. The car was idling, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a predator. He didn't look like the romantic boy from the Sepulchre anymore. In the harsh glow of the dashboard lights, his face looked sharp, almost skeletal. What happened in the next 10 minutes would be debated for decades. Zayide claims she saw him reach for something. She claims the look in his eyes was one of finality. She pulled the trigger twice. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in the limitations of 1993 forensics. When the police arrived, they didn't have the tools we take for granted today. They had to rely on venerable techniques that were considered cosmic truths at the time, but which we now know were deeply flawed. The first pillar of the prosecution's case was bloodstain pattern analysis. An expert took the stand, citing the founding texts of Herbert MacDonnell. He pointed to the medium-velocity impact spatter on Zayide's flannel shirt. He told the jury that this spatter proved she was standing within 3 feet of Kalen, that it was an execution, not a struggle. But here is the catch. In 1993, blood spatter analysis was largely subjective. Modern black box studies have shown an error rate of over 11% in these types of classifications. What the expert called high-velocity execution spatter could have easily been transfer stains from a desperate struggle for the gun. Then there was the DNA. This was the era of RFLP analysis. To get a match back then, you needed a massive amount of high-quality DNA, at least 100 nanograms, but the pier was humid, and the samples were degraded. The lab couldn't produce a definitive barcode match. Instead, they used a statistical assessment telling the jury there was an infinitesimal chance the blood belonged to anyone else. They were using convenience samples, not true random databases, to make a girl's life a matter of math. The most captivating piece of evidence was a VHS tape recovered from a nearby warehouse security camera. In 1993, CCTV was granular and unclear. A technician testified about computer enhancement. He froze the frames, digitized the pixels, and softened the edges of the shooter's face to remove graininess. But as we look back from the future, we know that 1993 enhancement often added features that weren't there. It created artifacts, digital ghosts, that the jury mistook for Zayide's face. They were convicting her based on a pixelated hallucination. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded teen who brought a gun to a romantic meeting. They focused on the fibers found on her shoes, fibers that were consistent with the carpet of Kalen's Corvette. In 1993, consistent with was a powerful phrase that made juries think guilty. Today, we know that those fibers were mass-produced in millions of cars. It proved she had been in a Corvette, but not necessarily his Corvette. As the trial moved forward, the intensity in the room was suffocating. The jury saw a girl who had recklessly placed herself in danger. They saw the gun as proof of malice. They didn't see the digital cage. They didn't see the codes. But the defense was preparing to drop a bomb that would tear the execution narrative to shreds. They had found a witness who had been digging into the shadows of 1993. Someone who realized that the victim lying on that pier was the greatest fiction of all. Kalen Thorne was about to be unmasked, and the truth would leave the audience wondering if Zayide Vane was the one who pulled the trigger, or if the gun had been in someone else's hand all along. The prosecution had finished building their wall. To the 12 men and women in the jury box, the case was a mathematical certainty. They saw a 17-year-old girl who had become obsessed with a boy, lured him to a derelict pier, and used a .22 caliber pistol to end his life. They saw the blood spatter on her flannel shirt and the grainy pixels of the VHS tape. In the punitive climate of 1993, they were ready to label Zayide Vane a super predator and lock the door forever. But the defense had one final witness. The courtroom doors swung open, and a man named Rohan Sanjay walked toward the stand. Rohan was a private investigator, a man who lived in the shadows of public records and microfiche. He had been hired by Zayide's mother, Adele, months before the shooting, when Zayide first started coming home with bruises she couldn't explain and pages she couldn't decode. Rohan Sanjay sat down, adjusted his tie, and looked directly at the lead prosecutor. He held a thick manila folder, the archived truth of a boy who didn't exist. "Mr. Sanjay," the defense attorney began, his voice echoing in the silent chamber, "you were tasked with performing a background check on the victim, Kalen Thorne. Tell the court what you found regarding his residence in Manhattan." Rohan leaned into the microphone. "Kalen Thorne has no residence. He has no social security number. He has no birth certificate. I traveled to the county where he claimed to be from. I found a Kalen Thorne in the local cemetery. He died in a car accident in 1978 when he was only 4 years old." A wave of murmurs broke out in the gallery. The judge hammered his gavel, but the sound was drowned out by the collective gasp of the audience. "If the boy on the pier wasn't Kalen Thorne," the attorney asked, "then who was he?" Rohan Sanjay opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It was a black and white image from 1981. It showed a small, angry-looking boy being led away from a house by a social worker. "The man Zayide Vane shot on Pier 54 was Jethro Vane," Rohan said. "He was her older brother." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and bone-cold. In the third row, Adele Vane collapsed. Her cries were raw, a haunting sound that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Zayide didn't move. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the floor, her jagged grunge bob shielding her face from the cameras. This is the moment that turned the 1993 pager code homicide from a tragic romance into a horrific family nightmare. If your jaw is on the floor right now, you need to share this video with a friend. Let's see if they can see this coming. Hit that share button and let the world know about the case the history books almost forgot. Rohan Sanjay began to lay out the mechanics of the double life. Jethro Vane had been removed from the family home 12 years earlier, in 1981, following a series of violent outbursts that the state deemed a threat to his infant sister, Zayide. He had spent his entire adolescence in secure detention facilities, bouncing between group homes and juvenile bureaus. He didn't just grow up, he fermented. He spent his nights in those facilities hunched over clunky Apple Macintosh Plus computers, teaching himself the language of the Wild West Internet. He learned how to steal identities. He learned how to manipulate bulletin board systems. And most importantly, he learned how to become a ghost. In early 1993, Jethro had tracked his family down. But he didn't want a reunion. He wanted a reclamation of control. He assumed the identity of the long-dead Kalen Thorne. He used stolen credit card numbers to lease that red Corvette. He used his knowledge of radio frequencies to clone Zayide's pager. He didn't just love her, he was archiving her. He wanted to drive her to the point of a violent outburst. He wanted her to pull the trigger so he could finally destroy the family that had exiled him. He was the rich idiot by day and a vengeful spectre by night. Rohan Sanjay presented the digital paper trail. He showed how Jethro had been the one sending the 911 and 187 codes to Zayide's beeper from an untraceable terminal in a 24-hour computer lab. He had even paged himself from her number, creating a false record of her stalking him. He was engineering his own martyrdom. The intensity in the courtroom was insanely high, as Rohan described the BBS logs. Jethro had posted on several fringe forums under the handle Thane, detailing his plan to become the ideal victim. He wrote about how he would lead his little sister to a pier and make her see a 911 emergency that would force her to strike. He didn't just die on that pier, Rohan whispered. He won. The prosecution tried to pivot. They argued that even if the victim's identity was a lie, the act of shooting him was still a choice. They said that Zayide had the duty to retreat. But the defense pointed to the psychological kidnapping Zayide had endured. They brought in experts to talk about the battered person syndrome. They argued that Jethro had created a world where Zayide was a butterfly in a stomach, trapped in a maelstrom of numeric threats and identity deconstruction. Where are you watching from as this twist unfolds? Does the year 1993 feel like a lifetime ago, or can you still hear the dial-up modem screech in your head? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. The jury was now faced with a moral impossible. Was Zayide Vane a murderer, or was she a victim of a social engineer who had used 1993 technology to craft a perfect, bloody suicide? Jethro Vane had spent 12 years becoming a monster just so he could prove his family was full of them. The pager code wasn't a language of love, it was a countdown. And as the defense rested, the only question left for the audience and the jury was whether Zayide had truly killed the ghost of 1981, or if Jethro had finally succeeded in making her just like him. This was the architecture of drama at its most lethal. A brother who became a lover to become a victim, a girl who became a shooter to become a survivor, and a neon green pager that sat in an evidence bag, its screen finally blank, its batteries dead, its job finished. The courtroom was a tomb on December 20th, 1993. The festive lights of Manhattan were visible through the frosted windows of the Superior Court, a stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating silence inside room 402. Zayide Vane stood to face the jury one last time. She didn't look like a girl anymore. She looked like a relic of a war that nobody else knew was being fought. The four-person stood up, the paper in their hand trembling slightly. On the charge of murder in the second degree, we find the defendant, Zayide Vane, guilty. The room didn't explode. There was only the sound of Adele Vane's breath hitching, a sharp, ragged intake of air that seemed to signal the final collapse of a family. The jury had rejected the first-degree murder charge, effectively negating the malice component that the prosecutor had fought so hard to prove. They couldn't call it a cold-blooded execution, but in the rigid legal landscape of 1993, they couldn't call it self-defense either. Zayide had brought a gun to a meeting. She had not retreated. Under the law of the time, that meant she was a killer. The judge peered over his spectacles, his voice devoid of the festive spirit waiting outside the doors. He sentenced Zayide Vane to 15 years to life in an adult correctional facility. At 17 years old, her life was being archived by the state. As the bailiffs moved in to lead her away, something happened that the court reporter's transcript didn't capture. A local news crew was filming a grim televised vignette for the nightly broadcast. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Zayide's wrists, she leaned toward the camera. Her ether-goth eyeliner was smudged, her face a mask of morbid calm. She whispered a single phrase that was lost in the shuffle of the courtroom, but would later be isolated by audio technicians. "I didn't kill Kalen," she whispered. "I killed the ghost of 1981. This case leaves a question that has haunted legal scholars for decades. Was Zayide Vane a predator, or was she the ultimate victim of a sister's instinct? What's your take? If you were on that jury in 1993, would you have sent her to prison? Drop your verdict in the comments. In the years following the trial, the Zayide Vane case became a venerable case study in the evolution of forensic science. As we moved into the 2000s, the fiber analysis that had linked her combat boots to the red Corvette was largely discredited. We now know that mass-produced nylon fibers cannot conclusively point to a single source. More importantly, modern STR profiling of the flannel shirt Zayide wore that night revealed something the 1993 RFLP method was too imprecise to detect. There was a third person's DNA on the sleeve. A ghost on the pier that the prosecution never looked for because they were too focused on the super predator narrative. And then there was the notebook. Years into her sentence, a forensic document examiner used an electrostatic detection device to look at the journals Jethro had kept while living as Kalen. They found indented writing on the back pages, messages he had written to himself, rehearsing the trauma he intended to inflict. The most haunting discovery was a note Zayide had written in the margins of her archaeology textbook, discovered only during a recent appeal. Using a video spectral comparator, experts revealed a message she had pressed so hard into the paper that it left a permanent mark. He told me 143, he told me 187, but the beeper doesn't know he's my brother. Only the gun knows the truth. The tragedy of 1993 was that the law didn't have a category for psychological kidnapping. The duty to retreat didn't account for a stalker who lived inside your own family tree. Zayide Vane remains in a cell today, a person of reasonable firmness, who was forced to solve a riddle where the only answer was a trigger pull. As we look back at the grainy VHS tapes and the neon green pages of that era, we are left with a lingering question. In a world of numeric codes and double lives, who was the real monster? Was it the girl who fired the shots, or the brother who spent 12 years engineering his own end just to ensure his sister would never be free? This investigation into the pager code homicide shows us that the truth is often buried under layers of outdated science and moral panic. If you want to see more deep dives into the cases that defined the American 90s, make sure you are subscribed to the Justice Minute. Your support helps us bring these stories back from the shadows. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, keep your eyes open and your beepers off.